week. Last week, I started a presentation looking at passages that are misunderstood. And I would like to continue that this week, and perhaps might even continue until next week. So last week we looked at the passage we looked at the biblical, the New Testament understanding of sin. And we also looked at what Jesus meant when he said that one jot or one tittle should in no wise pass from the law till all was fulfilled. And for those who were not around last week, that message is up on YouTube. It's on the second YouTube channel. So if you didn't get it, then you can look at it. But this week I want to continue because there are quite a few passages that are misunderstood, especially in the light of how people regard the law. All of you, like me, well, most of us have come from a law-oriented background. Somebody said that it seems like I really love to talk about the law and all of that. But the thing is, it's because of my background. I suppose that people are not from this kind of background, you might not be so focused on the things that I've been trying to share. But I'm understanding more and more clearly how one of the greatest obstructions to the message of Christ and his righteousness is a legal mindset, is a mind that is oriented towards the law. Now, I'm not against the law, but I'm against the law orientation. I'm against the idea that we are still governed by the law, we are still under the law, that the law is a central thing in the universe. I believe that this kind of mindset prevents people from understanding what Jesus Christ did, what God did for us through Jesus Christ. So if Jesus is to be the center of our message, then the law has to always keep coming into the picture, because the law is the great obstacle. And just if you think I'm wrong, if you go back to the Bible and look at the New Testament, you will find that it was the problem that the Apostle Paul faced more than anything else. Read through the New Testament, read through the writings of Paul and the Acts of the Apostles, and you'll find that the great enemies were not the Romans. The Romans, yes, the Romans were an instrument for killing some of the Christians, but the great enemies were the commandment-keeping Jews. They are the ones who created a problem in the early church. And it was in this kind of background that Paul kept talking about Christ and his righteousness, and he kept making these strange statements about the law that still befuddle people today. They don't understand what he means. They say Paul is hard to understand. It's because the perspective about the law is wrong. So I'm just saying this as a kind of preamble to say that if I seem to keep talking about the law, it's not because I'm suggesting that the law is bad. I'm suggesting that when we are oriented towards the law, we cannot understand the grace of God and the righteousness of Christ. So we have to put the law in its right place. So anyway, we're going to look at another of those difficult passages today. It's not difficult, but it's difficult if you have a legal mind and if you don't read the Bible properly. Now, I actually have a message on this particular subject up on YouTube already, but I'm going to revisit it today and try to go into it very carefully, because we are doing a study this morning. And what I would really enjoy, what I would really like, is if there is any aspect of what I'm saying that is not clear, please stop me. We're supposed to be having a study. I know this kind of platform is not the best, because I like to ask questions and I like to pinpoint people, and 90% of you are hidden. I can only see a few cameras, but please, if you have any questions, any brief comments, any point that you don't understand exactly what I'm trying to say, please stop me. And from time to time, I might just pick on somebody and ask you a question anyway. But anyway.
Good.
Yes, so far.
Just coming on because the internet was down, so I missed all of that. Sorry.
Okay, all right. I'm sorry. It was just a preamble. I was just kind of introducing what we're going to look at today. So I'm glad you're on. Howard was saying the same thing. Apparently, there was a power cut and his internet was down. Um, anyway, I'm going to share my screen now and I'm going to put the Bible on the screen. And of course, we're going to use the Bible as always as the basis for our study. So I need to close out this thing that's creating a little problem. Right. So what I want to look at this first of all this morning is a statement that Paul makes in Romans chapter 2 and verse 12. Verse 13, actually, not 12. Verse 13. It says, "For not the hearers of the law are just before God, but the doers of the law shall be justified." All right, now all of you know that the central teaching of our message is that we are justified by faith. We are justified by faith. This is our message. It's the message of the New Testament. It's the message of Paul. Grace through faith. Now here Paul comes and makes this strange statement. He says, the doers of the law shall be justified. And I step on this because it is one of the verses that people keep dragging us back to. They keep coming back to this verse and they say, the verse says it is the doers of the law who shall be justified. Therefore, we're not justified by faith alone. One of the questions I encountered early on in my experience as a Christian, where I mean, I saw where some of the teachers in the church would ask the question, are we justified by faith alone? They would add the word alone, because nobody can deny that we are justified by faith, but they add the word alone. And I came upon this confusing idea very early on that we're not justified by faith alone, but we are justified by faith if we keep the law. In other words, keeping the law has a part to do with being justified. And it did create some confusion in my mind for quite a number of years. Today, I'm very clear. I'm very clear in my mind. We are justified by faith alone, faith only. Keeping the law has nothing to do with justification, period. And I will resist and stand against anybody who says anything else. Justification is God's gift. It is God's grace, and our keeping of the law has nothing to do with it. So, why does Paul say, why does Paul, the great apostle, the apostle of faith, why does Paul say, the doers of the law shall be justified? It's right there before our eyes in black and white, or white and blue, as the case may be at this point. Why does Paul say this? And this is a beautiful opportunity for us to illustrate something. It is that proof texting when you're studying the Bible is a child's way of approaching the Bible. It's a way for children. It was my way at one point, right? But it's a child's method, because proof texting does not make you look at the context and the background and the broader argument of what is being said. And sometimes if you fail to do this, you are going to come to the exact opposite conclusion of what the person is saying. And in this case, that's what happens to many people. They say that Paul teaches that the doers of the law shall be justified. Now, let me show you the hypocrisy behind this, because when you go to Romans 3 and verse 20, just a few verses later, and in fact, I probably should change my view. Let me change my view and look at and put the two screens together, because all right, because it's Romans 2 and verse 13. And I want to compare that with Romans 3 and verse 20. All right, look at what he says in Romans 3 and verse 20. In Romans 2 and verse 13, he says, the doers of the law shall be justified. In Romans 3, the next chapter, in verse 20, he says, by the works of the law, no flesh will be justified in his sight. Let me do that in the King James Version. By the deeds of the law, there shall no flesh be justified in his sight. Now, you can't look at these two verses and tell me that they are saying the same thing. In fact, they are saying the exact opposite. Chapter 2, and then you step over to chapter 3, and it says the opposite. Chapter 2 says, the doers of the law shall be justified. Chapter 3, verse 20, by the deeds of the law, no flesh shall be justified in his sight. The two verses seem to be directly contradicting each other. In fact, let me look at a couple of other verses also, not just Romans 3 and verse 20. Look at Galatians 3 and verse 11, and see what it says. But that no man is justified by the law in the sight of God, it is evident, for the just shall live by faith. No man is justified by the law. Romans 2 and verse 13. The doers of the law shall be justified. Galatians 3 and verse 11. No man is justified by the law. All right. So this alone, if there were nothing else, brothers and sisters, it would tell us that we're not reading something properly. There's something here that we need to examine more closely. Paul is not blatantly contradicting himself. The overwhelming evidence from the writings of Paul is that nobody is justified by the law. If you go back, we're in Galatians 3 and verse 11. No man is justified by the law in the sight of God. If you go back one chapter, if you go back to chapter 2, Galatians 2, and you go down to about verse 15, is it? Verse 16, it says, knowing that a man is not justified by the works of the law. No, a man is not justified by the works of the law. So how is Paul saying in Romans 2 and verse 13 that the doers of the law shall be justified? That is an anomaly. That is something strange in Paul's writings. That is not what Paul teaches or believes. And so what this says to us, brothers and sisters, is that there's something we're not understanding, and I agree. And that is what we're going to set out to examine here a little more closely. Why does Paul say this, and what does he really mean? Let me make a little more room on my screen here. So we just have mostly this one. This is what we're going to focus on. So first of all, let's go back to Romans 2 and verse 13. The doers of the law shall be justified. Then I'm going to go up to the verse that is just before this one, verse 12. This kind of gives us the clue as to what is going on. In verse 12, Paul says, for as many as have sinned without the law shall also perish without the law. And as many as have sinned in the law shall be judged by the law. So who is Paul referring to? He mentions two groups of people. One of those, he says, they have sinned without the law. And the second group, he says, they have sinned in the law. So there are two categories of people, and two ways or two conditions under which people sin. Some sin without the law, and some sin with the law or in the law. Who is he referring to? Let me step back a little bit and go to another passage from Paul so that we can kind of figure out what he's saying here. I'm going to go to another passage, which is 1 Corinthians 9, verses 20 and 21. 1 Corinthians 9, 20 and 21. And see, he uses a similar phrase. In verse 20, he says, and unto the Jews I became as a Jew, that I might gain the Jews. To them that are under the law, as under the law, that I might gain them that are under the law. So he's referring to the Jews here, and he speaks of them as people that are under the law. Then in verse 21, he says, to them that are without law as without law. Who are these people that he's referring to as being without the law? Can somebody just quickly unmute your mic and just let me know? Who is he referring to when he says Gentiles? Thank you. I didn't get who that was, but thank you. So the two categories of people that he's referring to are the Jews and the Gentiles. And he refers to the Jews as those that are with the law or in the law or under the law, and the Gentiles as those who are without the law. So these are the two categories of people. And when we go back to Romans chapter 2, this is the first thing we need to understand. Paul is referring to two groups of people. He's focusing on two groups of people in trying to get us to understand. See, he refers in verse 12 again. Let's go back to verse 12. As many of us sinned without law shall also perish without law, and as many of us as have sinned in the law shall be judged by the law. Then in verse 14, that's the Jews, right? Then in verse 14, he speaks of the Gentiles. For when the Gentiles which have not the law, these are the ones who are without the law, they have not the law, they do by nature the things contained in the law. These having not the law are a law unto themselves. What he's talking about are people who don't have the law. They have no knowledge of the written law, of the spoken law, of the law of God. But there's something in their nature that gives them an awareness of right and wrong. In other words, they have a conscience, and the conscience directs them in right and wrong. And these have an awareness based on their conscience of what they should do and what they shouldn't do. Now, in the middle of it, Paul has this strange statement. Not the hearers of the law are just before God, but the doers of the law shall be justified. All right. Now, the clue to understanding this is to understand the way that the Apostle Paul writes. If you're not familiar with his writings, sometimes you have a problem understanding what he's doing. But let me simplify it. In this version of the Bible that I'm using, most of you will notice that sometimes some of the letters are, some of the phrases are written in bold letters. If you're familiar with the studies that we have been doing, let me see if I can find any in this chapter. Yes, here's some in the chapter, verse 24. It's bold, for the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles through you. And if you're familiar with this word Bible, you'll realize every time you come upon this bolded text, it means that it's a quotation from the Old Testament. So anywhere that Paul quotes from the Old Testament, the translators of the Bible, the people who put this version of the Bible together, they put it in bolded text to make us understand that it's a quote from the Old Testament, and we can go back and look to see where it is taken from. Now, they do a pretty good job, but sometimes they kind of mess up a little bit, because there are times when Paul quotes, and the quote is not an exact quote, and so they do not put it in bold, but it's really a quote from the Old Testament, or it's really a thought that comes from the Old Testament. And when you go back up to verse 13, that is what happens. When Paul says, the doers of the law shall be justified, this is not Paul's theology. This is the teaching of the law. Paul is referring to what the law teaches. The law teaches that it is those who do the law who will be accepted. Paul is using the argument of the Jews. Paul is using the theology of the Jews. He's using the argument of the law against the Jews. And we will see why he's doing this in just a moment, all right? But first of all, let me establish that this is what Paul is doing. I'm going to go to Leviticus 18 and verse 5, all right? Here's what God says. Here's what God says in the law. Here is the teaching of the law. You shall therefore keep my statutes and my judgments, which if a man do, he shall live in them. According to the law, what do you have to, what has to happen in order for you to live? You have to do. You have to do in order to live. This is the teaching of the law. Now, just in case you think I'm overdoing my case, let us go and see how Paul himself, in fact, let me give you back the double screen. It's very helpful, but because of how this software is laid out. Sometimes I have to keep switching back and forth because I have my dashboard on the right and I need to. Anyway, let's go to Galatians. Galatians chapter 3. Galatians chapter 3. And look at what it says here. Paul is quoting from look at what Paul says. Let's read verse 11 and 12. Galatians 3. But that no man is justified by the law in the sight of God, it is evident, for the just shall live by faith. Then he says, and the law is not of faith. And he quotes from this verse in Leviticus. But what is the law? The law says, the man that doeth them shall live in them. The man that doeth them shall live in them. He's saying that the law speaks about doing. But to be really just, those who are just, they do not live by doing, they live by believing. The just live by faith. The just live by faith. And the law is not of faith. So the just do not live by the law. The law is not of faith. The law speaks about doing. The law says the man that doeth them shall live in them. And he's quoting here from Leviticus 18 and verse 5. If a man do, he shall live. That's what the law teaches. And so Paul says, this is not how the just live. Now, please bear this in mind as we go back to what we read in Romans chapter 2. In Romans chapter 2, again back down to verse 13, you can understand this a little better now. The doers shall be justified. Paul is quoting from Leviticus, and he says the same thing here in Galatians. The man that doeth them shall live in them. That's all he's saying. He's simply saying what the law says. The doers of the law shall be justified. The man that doeth them shall live in them. So he's saying that according to the law, it is not the hearers of the law who will be justified before God. According to the law, it is the doers of the law who shall be justified. So this part here, in my opinion, it should have been in bolded letters. The translators of this version of the Bible, they should have put this in bolded letters to show you that Paul is making a reference to the Old Testament. But to be fair to them, what they have been putting in bold is what is an actual quotation. Here, Paul is not quoting the exact words. Instead, he's giving you the meaning. Now, I'm going to pause for just a moment because I'm anxious that we should understand what we just looked at in the Bible. Is there anybody who does not fully understand what I just said? Please unmute your mic and let me know.
Clear as day.
Thank you, Brother Arthur. All right. We have 84 people and everybody seems to understand. I am praising the Lord because that is good. If we have 84 of us and we all understand what we just went through, then I can say thank God. So
I want to add something. Maybe you should clarify a bit what you mean by justification, because one idea is that, well, if you receive the Spirit of God and you are of faith, you actually will naturally do those things. So one might say that you cannot be justified if you have faith, but your works look like you are from the world. So maybe you should just clarify what you mean by justification. Why is that so special?
thank you very much, Claudia. That's a very, very good point, and I appreciate it because that's exactly what people say, and that's exactly what we need to do. Clarify what we mean by justify. Now, the word justify, as you can tell, is a legal word. It's a legal term because it comes from the word just or justice. It's related to those words. And justice, as you know, is a legal term, as I said. And when is a criminal justified? If I ask you this question, when is a criminal justified? That can help to clarify the question, because a criminal is not justified when he goes out and begins to live a holy life. A criminal is justified when he comes before the judge and the judge says, not guilty. In that instant, he's justified. What he does afterwards is not justification. It has nothing to do with justification. Justification is the moment when you are declared to be just. So that is the real issue. Does a person become just when he begins to do good, or does a person become justified? Does he become innocent and blameless the moment he receives Jesus Christ, the moment he believes? That is the million-dollar question. And those who try to add what you do, they are destroying the work of Christ. They are saying that what Christ did is not enough to make you acceptable to God. That's the point. It is what makes me acceptable in the eyes of God. Now, if justification was not simply faith, then the thief on the cross could not be saved, because the thief on the cross, he died as a criminal. And for all we know, he never did one good thing after he accepted Jesus. He ended up in jail. I suppose you could say that he did one good thing when he said, Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom. Then you could say that all we need to do to be saved is that we need to say, Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom. The point is, faith is what made Jesus say to this thief, you will be with me in paradise. And faith is the only basis on which we are acceptable to God. Justification, in simple terms, means the basis on which God says, I accept you. And if it were by works, as I say all the time, and I love to say, then the strong would live and the weak would die. And if it were by education, the educated would live and the ignorant would die. And if it were by wisdom, the wise would live and the stupid would die. But it is by grace through faith. And even a fool can believe. Praise the Lord.
Bless Yahuwah.
Hallelujah. So, this is what Paul is saying when he says that.
Brother,
Yes, brother. Is it brother? Brother Ayai?
yes. Can I add something to what you just said?
Sure, go right ahead.
Okay. To add to this, in Luke chapter 18, Jesus was talking about two men who went to the temple to pray.
Yes.
And one said, I thank you that I'm not like the other man. I pay my tithe and I do this and I do that. And the second one, Jesus said that he didn't even dare to raise his eyes, but he said, Lord, what did he say again?
Be merciful to me as sinner.
Have mercy on me. Have mercy on me, sinner. And Jesus said, I tell you, this one went to his home justified.
Yes.
He didn't do anything. He has recognized his situation, and to say he accepts that he is a sinner and he asks for forgiveness, and God said, okay, you are justified. So it has nothing to do with what he done.
He abandoned himself to the mercy of God.
Bless Yahuwah.
The best thing to do. Abandon yourself to the mercy of God and leave yourself out of the picture and say, let your goodness do what it needs to do. And that is it. At that moment, God justifies the person who can say, I threw myself into your arms. That's all. So, Paul is not saying that.
I want to ask something more. Is there a verse in the Bible that clarifies for us that justification is synonym with acceptance of God towards man? Or is just something you can get out of the context?
Well, at the moment, I can think of the context. Maybe if I think about it, maybe I'll find a verse, but it's not at my fingertips at the moment. But the context, of course, makes it clear.
Brother David.
Yes, Brother Arthur.
The example my brother just used regarding the thief on the cross and even the publican is a perfect example as to what constitutes justification. Yes. Christ made it absolutely clear what it is. The thief on the cross never did anything. All he did, he thrust himself in the arms of Yeshua. The publican, he had nothing to show either. What he did, he threw himself at the feet of Yeshua, and he pleaded for mercy. He had nothing to show. He recognized the mercy and the grace of Yahuwah, and he pleaded for that. The scripture says that man left, went home, justified. I don't think there's need to be anything much clearer than this as to what constitutes justification.
Yes, I know that Sister Claudia is very familiar with it. I think she's wondering, is there any verse that you can give people who tend to be intransigent, because people tend to be like that when it comes to this topic, and I can understand. I know that most of us, and this is where I am, I love to reason about the scriptures. I am becoming less and less focused on the proof text, because the proof text is a form of legalism, but I understand why it's helpful. I understand, But when you look at all the statements about justification in the Bible, the conclusion is impossible to miss. You can't miss the conclusion. It has nothing to do with what you do. It is exclusively that moment when God accepts you, So, but as I said, if anybody can think of a verse that really expresses it, justification is this or something of that nature, then please share with us. But I'll give it some thought. At the moment, it's not at my fingertips. All right. So let's continue.
Brother David.
Yes, Brother Matt.
Brother David. Yes, ma'am. Being that justification and righteousness kind of work synonymously, would it be correct to say that in Daniel 9, in the first quarter of the chapter, Daniel's prayer, confessing Israel's sins, and then speaking about God's faithfulness to his covenant, explains that he is the only one who is righteous, that we're not righteous. Do you know what I'm talking about? You know the verses that I'm talking about?
Yes.
So wouldn't that kind of just confirm where justification or righteousness comes from? Because no one has been made just or righteous ever. Only God is righteous.
Right. I think one of the things, and I think this is what Sister Claudia's question is aimed at, is because the word righteousness has several implications. It can mean in a state of being right, but it's also used to imply the process by which you live an upright life. It can have those two implications. So when she talked about justification actually has only one meaning, technically, one meaning. It's the moment in which you become acceptable. It's not a process, and it cannot refer to the experience of how you live. Justification is a legal term, and it refers to a moment in time. I think that's what she's emphasizing. So that's why I would avoid the word righteousness, because righteousness is a broader spectrum.
Yes, that's what I wanted to underline, the difference between those two words, actually.
All right. Yes, I kind of figured. So thanks for the question, and thanks for all the comments. Now, let me go a little further with this this verse and this passage, just to highlight what we already said, that Paul is talking about Jews and Gentiles. What is he really doing in this passage? There are two amazing verses I wanted to look at, because one of the things that I believe we must come to, my brothers and sisters, is the fact that God's purposes in the Old and New Covenant are different. They are not two sides. They're not the same covenant in two ages. That is absolutely not true. That is one of the things that people keep saying, but it's not true. The statements that are made in both covenants are so amazingly different. Look at what it says here in Exodus 23 and verse 7. Look at what it says. Keep thee far from a false matter, and the innocent and righteous slay thou not. For I will not justify the wicked. I will not justify the wicked. And look at what Paul says in Romans 4 and verse 5. But to him that worketh not, but believeth on him that does what? Justifieth the ungodly. His faith is counted for righteousness. Notice what it says under the law. I will not justify the wicked. Notice what it says under the gospel. God justifies the ungodly. I mean, you can say there's a little nuance of meaning, because does God justify a wicked person if he continues to be wicked? But again, it comes to the question, when is a person justified? When he's justified, he's in a state of ungodliness. When a person is justified, the thief on the cross, I don't know if he was just a thief or he did other terrible things, but he was justified in the condition as a thief. He only was no longer a thief after he was justified. God does not justify the wicked, but the New Testament says he does justify the wicked. It's two different perspectives. Under the system of the law, God was trying to bring out a certain principles and certain ideas, and it had to do with man's attentiveness, man learning morality, trying to restrain the carnal nature. Under the new covenant, the carnal nature becomes irrelevant because God gives you a new nature. You are born again, and the carnal nature becomes irrelevant because now in your new state, righteousness is produced in your life. When you are justified and you have received Christ, righteousness is produced in your life. You do not need to be attentive to morality. You need to be attentive to Christ. That's how it is under the new system. So anyway, I just wanted to put that in as a little side note to what we are looking at. But let's go back to the passage. I want to read from Romans 2 again, still in Romans 2, and I want to look at verses 17 to 24. Now, I want us to see the argument of what is happening in this chapter 2 of Romans. Let me expand it a little bit more. Most of us know that Romans is called the gospel in miniature. It's a book in the Bible where you have the gospel explained in the most detail out of any of the books in the Bible. So it's called the gospel in miniature. But the first part of the book of Romans, the first part, what Paul is trying to do is to prove that everybody needs Christ. All right, so you know, I have relatives and I have friends who will say to me, I don't go to church, but you know, I serve God. I don't deny this. I don't reject this because I know that it is sometimes true. But what many of these people want to say is that I don't need to make a commitment to Christ in order to be acceptable to God. What they are saying is that I am a moral person. I don't break into my neighbor's home. I don't go and visit my neighbor's wife when he's away. I don't do these things, so I'm a good person. And because I'm a good person, God will accept me. This is what a lot of people think. They believe that their condition is just as good as Christianity because they are morally upright. These are non-Christian legalists. Like so many Christians, what they are doing is measuring their worthiness by their behavior. They think that because I do good, I'm qualified. This is the attitude that is most abhorrent to God. Self-righteousness is the worst kind of attitude, and it's the hardest disease for God to cure. It's the hardest disease because a self-righteous person does not know how much he needs Christ. So Paul is writing and he's trying to prove to everybody that they need Christ. They need salvation. Who do you think will be the most difficult people to convince? The ancient Seventh-day Adventists, of course. The ancient Seventh-day Adventists, the Jews, they are the ones who are the hardest people to convince that they need Christ. Why? Because they have the law. Oh, goodness gracious, man, how things never change. How everything goes around in circles, right? We are God's commandment keeping people. This was the Jews. They did not need Christ. Now, in chapter 1, Paul shows you that the Gentiles need Christ. No problem. The Gentiles would be easy to convince about this. because they know that they are rapists, murderers, looters, all this. They know that they need Christ. And Paul says, when they don't know God, they turn to homosexuality and so forth. And so they know that they need God. And the Jews will say, Amen. When you say how wicked they are, they will say, these people are, the Jews will say, Amen. Now, Paul says, you Jews, you need Christ just the same. And the Jews will say, ridiculous. We're God's people. We have the law. We were given the law. We are special to God. Now see Paul's argument. Look at how Paul addresses these Jews. Look from verse 17. Same Romans chapter 2. Behold, thou art called a Jew. All right, good. And restest in the law. The law is your foundation. You have confidence in the law, and makest thy boast of God. And knowest his will, you know his will, and thou approvest the things that are more excellent, being instructed out of the law, and art confident that thou thyself art a guide of the blind, a light of them which are in darkness. See how Paul is bigging them up. This is exactly what they think about themselves, just like modern Jews. An instructor of the foolish, a teacher of babes, which has the form of knowledge and of the truth in the law. Thou therefore that teachest another, teachest thou not thyself? Now he comes down to the crux. He says, you hypocrites, you have the law. Are you keeping the law? Thou that preachest a man should not steal, dost thou steal? Thou that sayest a man should not commit adultery, dost thou commit adultery? Thou that abhorrest idols, dost thou commit sacrilege? Thou that makest the boast of the law, through breaking the law, dishonorest thou God? For the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles through you. What is he trying to tell these Jews? You have the law, but you do not keep the law. It has become, I like to do this, right? I've been doing this on Facebook a bit these days. Not because I want to create trouble, but because I want to get people to look at themselves. When these, well, Adventists mostly, right? Adventists, Seventh-day Church of God, Shepherd Rod, whatever they are, they all jump in and they start to beat me with the law. And I always ask, I've been asking this question recently. I say, do you keep the law? Goodness me, there's a deafening silence. Nobody will answer the question. They refuse to address the question because they themselves will tell you that the law reaches to the deepest parts of the heart and of the mind. Do you keep the law? Because the point is, as James tells us, if you keep the whole law and yet you offend in one point, you are guilty of all. So you make your boast of the law. You rest in the law. You claim to be a teacher of the blind, a guide of those in darkness. Do you keep the law that you are promoting and boosting? And nobody can come and say, yes, I do. And I point out when Jesus was asked, when Jesus could say, which of you convinced me of sin? These people, they boast in the law, but they do not keep the law. And this is what Paul is saying to these Jews. And the point he's making is, here's the point. Doesn't it occur to you that this way of salvation ain't working? Doesn't it occur to you that you need something else? Because his point is, you need Christ and the Gentiles need Christ. You condemn the Gentiles, you need Christ too.
Brother David.
Yes, Brother Arthur.
Can I say something?
Sure, go ahead.
There's something I've observed with those who continue to harp on the law, and they would sometimes make false allegation that we're promoting that the law should not be kept. There's one thing that is symptomatic of all of these individuals. They all travel with a pruning knife, and every day they seems to be pruning away, and they can never stop pruning. Every day they have another thing to prune off the corrupted tree, and they seem not to get it that it doesn't work and it cannot work.
Yes.
But as hard as we try, it's like it's the hardest thing to get in the cranium of Seventh-day Adventists, especially.
Yes, unfortunately. The thing is that I'm going to tell you, it's not Seventh-day Adventists and it's not Jews. That's not the issue. You know what the issue is? It's human nature. When you take any human being and you make him believe that he has a divine right, whether it's a Jew, an Adventist, a Baptist, a Jehovah's Witness, anybody that you give that false idea that he's special because God has put him in a special place, because he himself has some qualities, some ability, you are destroying that person. So the unfortunate thing is that it happens to have fallen upon Adventists and a few other people as well, Jehovah's Witnesses and a few others, right? But the thing is, we feel it acutely because we are in that Adventist environment, and they are in this condition, just as the Jews were in that condition. The only cure for this is to recognize I am nothing and I need Christ, and everything that I have and that I am is a gift. Why do you boast in another man's gift? If you boast about the man. Boast about the man. That is why the law has to be knocked off the pedestal, because the law gives you room to say, I have done this, I have achieved. When it is Christ in you, why do you boast when Jesus has done it? Why do you take unto yourself his glory? This is why it must be by grace through faith, as Paul says, that the glory may belong to God.
Can I say one more word?
Sure.
This brings back to my mind the folks that are pushing the feast idea. To me, it's just so defeating or seeking to defeat what Yeshua has done for us, as though it was not adequate, and so they need to continue with all of these earthly carnal things.
Yes, it's a misunderstanding of the covenants. It's a misunderstanding of the place of the law and the purpose of the law. So this is the point that Paul is making, and that is why he says in verse 13, this is a verse we really are clarifying today, and I hope, well, everybody seems to have gotten it, and I hope it's so deeply embedded we'll never get out of it. But it says, when Paul says the doers of the law shall be justified, he is using the Jews' theology, which is the law. He's using their theology, and I say to you, and it's what I do. It's what I do sometimes with these brethren from Adventism. I say, do you keep the law? They say, but David, you are saying that we are not under the law. I said, that is my theology, but your theology is that we must keep the law. Do you keep it? Because that's your theology. So I'm using your argument. In my theology, my keeping of the law is not what saves me. In my theology, I am saved by grace through faith, and keeping the law is incidental. It happens, but it has nothing to do with my salvation. But in your theology, law keeping is important to your salvation. So do you keep the law? That's what Paul is saying to these Jews. Your teaching says that the doers of the law shall be justified, and you don't keep the law. So what is he doing? He's knocking away their support from under their feet. He's knocking their legs out from under them to leave them flat on their backs, where they recognize, I have no foundation. I have nothing to lean on. I need Jesus Christ. That's what he's doing. Now there is a second important point to what we are looking at today. And this second important point is that I hope we are learning that when you come to the Bible, you should not treat it in a superficial way. Just reading the Bible like this, right? Like a child reads his storybook, is not a wise way to approach the Bible. And the fact that people do this, they don't take the time and examine and read and pray for wisdom. The fact that people don't do this is the reason why there's so much confusion and so many different ideas. The Bible itself is clear if you take the time to examine it carefully. Now, just to reinforce, let's go back up in the chapter a little bit, up to verses 9 and 10, just to reinforce that he's looking at the contrast between Jews and Gentiles. He says, tribulation and anguish upon every soul of man that doeth evil, of the Jew first and also of the Gentile. But glory and honor and peace to every man that worketh good, to the Jew first and also to the Gentile. But there is no respect of persons with God. What he's saying is that whether you are Jew or Gentile, if you do bad, there's going to be tribulation, and you are going to be damned, in other words. And if you do good, you are going to be accepted. And then he ends up by saying, which of you is doing good? So he makes it clear, to be accepted, you need to do good. And to be condemned, you need to do bad. But none of you is doing good. So all of you are condemned. So he's going to show you that there is a different way to obtain that good status. And it is righteousness by faith. That's the point. All right? Now let's go over to Romans chapter 3, the next chapter. And we see the conclusion of his argument. So here's what he concludes. And this is just to put the final nail in the coffin in terms of the context of what we are looking at. Here's what he says. What then? Are we better than they? He's talking to Jews now. Are we better than they, the Gentiles? No, in no wise. For we have before proved both Jews and Gentiles that they are all under sin. That's the bottom line to his argument. So we could use the same argument today to these religionists who believe that they are acceptable to God because they have the law and because they are teachers of those in darkness and they are guides of the blind. We could use the same argument. I mean, one of the things that these same brethren keep saying to me is that we are all sinners. All right? Strangely enough, when you ask them, do you keep the law? Well, maybe it's not so strange. If you ask, do you keep the law? And they say they can't answer, then it's not strange that they should say we're all sinners, right? I mean, I can say that I'm not a sinner because I understand what sin is. I'm not a sinner. I'm not in a state of separation from God. If it happens that I might stumble along the way, I might do something that is wrong, this does not make me a sinner. A sinner is a habitual rebel against God. When I'm in a family and I happen to step outside of the pattern of that family, it does not make me lose my identity. It simply means that I've acted out of character. But I don't lose my identity. I'm not a sinner. But here's what Paul says. We have proved, Jews and Gentiles, that all are under sin. And I could say the same thing to those who are trying to find God through the law. You are under sin, and you will never be otherwise, because Paul says those who are under the law are cursed. Those who are of the works of the law are cursed. And the curse is that you're under sin as long as you live. So the man out there who has never made a commitment to God, the man who is a drunkard, a murderer, a liar, a thief, a blasphemer, he is a sinner. And so are you, if you are seeking God, expecting to be accepted by keeping the law, because you never have done it from the day you were born. So Paul says, we have proved that everybody is under sin, Jew and Gentile. And then he goes on now to quote from the law. Look at this next passage here. These next few verses. You notice all of them are in bolded letters. Write down. Everything is in bold. And why is it? Because he's quoting. He's quoting from the Psalms, most of them. He says, we have proved, both Jews and Gentiles, that they are all under sin. As it is written, and now he's quoting from Psalms, there's none righteous, no, not one. There's none that understandeth, there's none that seeketh after God. Now here's a question. I'm going to ask you the question before Paul asks the question. Who is these verses referring to? I wouldn't mind if somebody can give me an answer to this question. These verses are written in the book of the Psalms. To
The
whom?
Jews.
Thank you, Brother Frederick. Thank you. Because the Psalms were not written for Gentiles. They were written by David and by Asaph, and they were written to the Jews. So when it says there's none righteous, no, not one, it's not speaking about people who are Gentiles. There's none that understand it. There's none that seek it after God. They're all gone out of the way. They are together become unprofitable. There's none that do it good. No, not one. It's like I could say to these folks, which of you keeps the law? No, not one. That's what I would conclude. Their throat is an open sepulchre. With their tongues they have used deceit. The poison of asps is under their lips. Whose mouth is full of cursing and bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed blood. Destruction and misery are in their ways, and the way of peace they have not known. There's no fear of God before their eyes. And see what Paul says next? Now, we know that what things soever the law saith, it said to them who are under the law. Just like Brother Frederick says, this is talking to Jews. This is what is written in the law. Now, just to explain a little bit, some of us, when he talks about the law, we might think that it's talking about the books of Moses, or it might talk about what came at Mount Sinai. But in the New Testament, the word the law, it refers not just to the books of Moses and not just to the books, the writings that came at Mount Sinai. Many times it refers to the entire Old Testament scriptures. Jesus uses it that way. Paul uses it that way, and other writers. So this is what Paul is saying. Now we know, we Jews know, we Christians know that whatever the law says, it is speaking to those who are under the law. And the people who were under the law were the Jews. So these words that were written in Psalms, they are written to the Jews. Why is this written to the Jews? Look what Paul says next. That every mouth may be stopped, and all the world may become guilty before God. Now when he says every mouth, and when he says all the world, do you think he's focusing on Jews or Gentiles mostly? Well, I mean, obviously, primarily what?
Primarily the Jews.
Thank you, Brother Arthur. And I agree with you, because everybody knows that the Gentiles are guilty. Everybody knows that the world is full of sin and so forth. The people who have a problem are the religious people. And so Paul says, the people who are under the law is speaking to you so that your mouth can be stopped and you can know that you are guilty before God. So that's his point. And that is why he said earlier on in the previous chapter, back to our starting verse, because this has brought us to the end of our time and the end of the study. Back to our starting point. For not the hearers of the law are just before God, but the doers of the law shall be justified. So that's the context of this verse. And I hope that based on what we have looked at this morning, you understand it perfectly now. And so the next time somebody brings up this verse, because it's one of the verses they like to go to, because they think it's an unopposable verse. But once you understand the context, it becomes clear that it is saying the exact opposite of what these folks understand it to be saying.
Brother David?
Yes, Brother Cliff.
Real quick, do you think that Deuteronomy 6:24 is similar to Romans 2:13 that you're talking about?
I agree with you. I agree with you, Cliff. And let's just look at it quickly, because it says it has the same thought. The wording is a little different, which is why I didn't go there. But it has the same thought. It says, and it shall be our righteousness. It shall be our righteousness, if we observe to do all these commandments before the Lord our God, as he has commanded us. Notice that this is what the law teaches. Our righteousness, if we do. Our righteousness, if we do. And that's the teaching of the Old Covenant. And it's the same thing that says, like it says in Leviticus 18 and verse 5, those who do these things shall live. It's the same thing, you know. So thank you, brother Cliff. I agree. And I'm still waiting on you to tell me when you're going to sing. All right?
Brother D.
Yes, let me. I hope Brother Cliff didn't run away, but you heard that, Brother Cliff?
I did not. I was trying to unmute myself. It's coming. It's coming.
All right, thank you. All right, go ahead, Brother Frederick. And we will pray after this, close the meeting. Go ahead, Brother Frederick.
You see that Paul just tore down the means by which the Jews thought they were justified.
Yes.
Right? They were very much confident in the law, and the law, of course, says that those who do the law shall be justified or shall be righteous. But Paul just highlighted to them that there's none that was able to do the law. So all are all fall under the same category of wicked. It says none, the wicked shall not be justified. So every man now falls under that category of being a wicked or a wicked person. So Paul just tore down that platform that they stood on, believing that they were righteous or better than the others.
Yes. And so you have to find another way of approach. Yes, Brother Warren.
I'm just thinking too, a lot of times they bring in the verse in Revelation, you know, saying those who keep the commandments of God and have the faith of Jesus. So they're saying the end time people must keep the commandments of God. So they tie it in using those verses, which make it very difficult to explain as well, because it's hard. Yeah, it's hard for them to differentiate that the commandments have nothing to do with their salvation, but it's all by justification. But they got to bring in the commandment somewhere, otherwise they feel like they're not the remnant people.
Exactly. And
I don't know how to explain that to them, you know.
I'm going, like I said, this is part 2 of the misunderstood passages, but next week I'm coming to those in Revelation, because there are a few more, and I do have those on the list. Yes, Claudia, go ahead.
I think the difficulty comes from the fact that many don't understand what justification means. And that's why we have a difficulty in trying to show them what we believe, because they equal justification with life that is lived righteously and just. And I think there's where we have to make a difference between these two aspects, so we can bring home to them that there's a difference, because they also are right that you cannot say that you are Christian and yet live habitually as a worldly person. That is equally true.
Yes. Thank you very much, because that is really the heart of it, as you said. That's the heart of it. Making these distinctions very clear, it makes sense of our religion and it explains the different parts of it. So thank you very much.
Brother David, may I say something?
Yes, Sister Charmaine.
I think that sometimes our human nature, we want to hold on to something that we can do to justify ourselves in any situation. It gives us a sense of control and even a sense of participation. And then we feel, I also did something. It's very difficult to receive a gift very often. So we want to say, well, thank you very much. What can I do for you? But Paul was trying really hard to explain to the Jews and to the new Christians that the law was, as he said in Galatians chapter 3:24, it was just that schoolmaster to teach you a lesson to bring you to Christ. But if we don't realize that it was there for a purpose, but it wasn't the end goal, we'll always miss the point. Because then in Galatians 5, he goes on to say from verse 3, for I testify again to every man that is circumcised that he is a debtor to do the whole law. Christ is become of no effect unto you, whoever you are, justified by the law, ye are fallen from grace. This is a very hard saying, but we have to understand the law was just there for a purpose. But if you hold on to it, there was no point in Christ coming.
Yes. I appreciate that also. The thing is that I mean, I suppose everybody's the same. By nature, I am an egotist. By nature, I want to know that I can do things better than you. By nature, I want to know that I can receive praise for what I did. When I go to heaven, I'd like to say, I did it, Jesus. I deserve this. Okay, give me my reward. It's an instinct I see in a little child. Okay, even if you give a child a present, he says, mine is better than yours. You give it to him, and he's boasting about it that it's better than yours. He wants to find a way to make it into a competition. And I see this in religion all the time. I see people trying to say, I am saved and you are lost because I do this and you don't do this. It's a way of putting yourself up, and it helps you to put other people down. And so this is the reason behind the whole idea that grace is so difficult to accept.
But anyway,
when you have divorced yourself from any credit at all and you recognize it's absolutely 100% the work of God, all you can do is praise God. This is where
Yes.
true selflessness and God's
people
truth
need to
comes
use the
because
microphone.
no. Anyway, I think my time is up, so I think we should have a closing prayer, and then maybe in the short break we can talk a little bit more if we want. But let me stop the recording and then we'll pray.